morning.
Thank you for coming back for part two. I was so enthralled last week. I was thinking about it most of the day. I was like processing all that. I was like, that was like an explosion of information and enthusiasm. It's always wonderful to learn from professional teachers, people that really know and love their subject matter. You can tell. I was thinking, no notes even. She must know this stuff so well. So it was super interesting. I'm glad you're back. And now the artistic piece of it, which will be really cool as well. So I will not talk too much. Turn it over to Ivonne. Thank you again for being back this week, and looking forward to part two here with you all.
All right, thank you so much, David. And thank you everyone again for giving me this opportunity to share this knowledge with you. I had a great time last week. And I hope that you guys will enjoy this week as well. So I have the same PowerPoint that I started with last week, to which I have added for what we're going to cover at the end of what we saw last week. But I thought, just in case somebody here wasn't here last week, that we go really, really quickly and give you the 3-second recap that they give you at the beginning of every Netflix series, right? So that's what we're going to do here. So what we covered last time was the surprising history that is often left out when we talk about the West, because the West, of course, is rooted in Greece and Rome, and is often left out when we talk about Islam, because Islam follows the Caliphate, right? And when the Caliphate moves from Damascus to Baghdad, right, this little spur of that particular family tends to get left out, right? And it happens to be in Europe, right, in Iberia. So we covered the explosive growth of the Islamic Empire, which in many ways reproduced a lot of the benefits of the Roman Empire for people who happened to fall under its sway. We learned something really interesting about the Islamic Empire, which is that it usually didn't force people to convert if they were already a people of the book, if they were already Jewish, or if they were already Christian. They were considered to be people of previous revelations, and as long as they paid their tax, which was an important source of revenue, right, they were left alone. So there was even an incentive to ensure that these people were not forcibly converted. We talked about how that meant that for the indigenous populations of the Iberian Peninsula, right, the land that we now call Spain and Portugal, that meant that when the Islamic Empire started coming in after 711, new opportunities arose for Jewish communities that were already there, who were now allowed to become not just active, thriving members of communities, but in many cases, some of their leaders and some of their scholars, some of their sages were given influence that would have been unimaginable, right, before under this adopted or Christian times. We talked about how that created the opportunity for the flowering of their capital city in Córdoba, right? And these, of course, are beautiful arches, the horseshoe arches in the Mosque of Córdoba. This gorgeous view of the Alhambra in Spain, which all of you promised me you will eventually visit, right? Show us what some of these technologies were really critical in achieving, right? One of the things that the Islamic Empire brings in are advanced technologies in science, in agriculture, in textiles, really all of the luxury technologies of the age that allows this flowering, a literal flowering, a more fertile landscape, a garden, a paradise in Córdoba, which should be remembered always as trying to recreate the glory and brilliance of Damascus, and creates this space for incredible achievements of the human imagination, like, for example, Abbas ibn Firnas, who we now know was the first human being to achieve flight in Córdoba. But of course, humans are going to human, and sometimes people don't like it when they lose influence. And we talked about the experience of the Córdoba martyrs. So these were young Christian zealots who were really, really upset that as more people learned Arabic and became culturally Arabic, even though they remained Christian, right, even though they remained Jewish, they were afraid that Latin and Christian identity was being lost. And so their answer to this was, we are going to martyr ourselves by going up to Islamic judges and blaspheming the prophet on purpose, which will get you killed. It will absolutely lead to your execution. And these young men and some women actually were hoping to start a larger rebellion among the Christians in Córdoba, but they failed. And what that tells us is that the vast majority of Christians in Córdoba at that time did not want to upend their social system. Then we talked about how all good things, of course, must come to an end. Cordoba, which had flourished for 200 years, is destroyed in a brutal civil war at the turn of the millennium. And these, of course, are the really evocative and nostalgic ruins of Medina Tan Sacra, the palace of the caliph on the outskirts of Cordoba. You can still sort of see the little echoes of the red and white candy-striped arches, right? And it tells us, right, that something terrible has happened. But this civil war, which we might expect to come from fighting between Christians and Muslims, in fact, comes from intra-Muslim conflict, right? It is Berbers fighting people in Cordoba. It is a Muslim civil war. It is not a Christian-Muslim civil war. But it completely destroys Cordoba. A tragedy of world-shattering proportions to everybody who was there. But as I left last time with a metaphor, I suggested that it was like a big, beautiful platter, right? A big, beautiful stained glass window, if you will, right? That when you destroy it, it is true, like you will never reproduce that window again. That window is gone forever. All that will live is that memory, right? The memory of what that window once was. But what you did do is you took those brilliant shards and you spilled them all over the floor. And that floor, of course, is the Iberian Peninsula. And so what we have now, what we're going to call the Taifa period, is a land that is scattered with brilliant, yet very sharp shards of glass everywhere, right? Always remembering back to Cordoba, which again was always remembering back to Damascus, right? So we're talking about layers and layers of memory and nostalgia and wanting and desire. And that's what all of these Taifa kingdoms are going to want to recreate. Each one of them wants to be a little Cordoba. Each one of them wants to be a little Damascus. And the way you do that is you get the best poets. You get the best food, you get the best architecture, and they're going to compete among each other to try to recreate that glory. And so from our perspective, 1,000 years later, this is actually a time of great flowering, right? This is a time of cultural innovation, even though for them, it was Armageddon, right? It was the greatest destruction they could have imagined, okay? So this, of course, was Alhambra. Here we are, the Taifa kingdom. Okay? Civil war has destroyed the unity of Cordoba. What you see before you here is each one of these is now a little kingdom. Taifa means party, right? By which they mean a small part, right? Like a little partisan. So it's a party kingdom. But as scholars in the field say, like party there works both ways, right? Because it's also one of the things that these courts are going to try to do is recreate this culture of leisure, beauty, poetry, right? So we may have an image in our mind of what we think Islamic court life might be. Let me tell you that, for example, one of the principal ways that people socialized in these courts were in wine parties that lasted all night on the banks of beautiful rivers and gardens, right? So much so that there is actually a genre of poetry called wine party poetry, right? Which are poems that were composed just for this occasion, right? So everything we think we might know about like the rigor and the joylessness, right, in which Islam is often portrayed in the Christian world, that does not really describe the world that these men and some women live in. So here are all these types, all these little kingdoms. What you need to know is that these little kingdoms are all going to be fighting against each other. They're all going to try to be expanding their boundaries, right? They're all going to try to grow. Because again, the goal here is one of us, there can be only one, as the old Highlander movie taught us, right? And that one will become Cordoba. So we're all trying to fight and get bigger and bigger and bigger, right? As we said, some of that is going to be cultural fighting. Some of it, as we will see later, is also military fighting. It is by the sword. There are a couple titles that I would like to call your attention to. Here's Cordoba, of course, right? The central capital, where it all began. The Taifa that will become most powerful, right? That if everything were allowed to take its place, probably would have eaten all of its competitors the way that bigger fish eat smaller fish, is Seville, right here. And we're going to be talking a lot about the Taifa of Granada here. So those are where we are. You'll notice that we are in the very, very south still of Al-Andalus, the region in Spain called Andalusia. All right, I had to put this here because I think this is the world's best titled academic monograph. I mean, seriously, if you saw that on the syllabus, would you be excited? I know I was, right? So we're going to start with an exemplary figure. An exemplary figure of the Hebrew golden age of poetry. His name is Samuel El Nagid. Nagid means prince, right? So this is an epithet he took for himself, right? Samuel the Prince. He's a wonderful figure to think about, not just because he's an excellent poet, right? But because he encapsulates a lot of the possibilities and potentials of this age, right? Of course, he is exceptional. So I tell my students, anybody whose name I am telling you 1,000 years after his death is by definition exceptional, right? But we can use him to think about the possibilities of this age. He was born in Córdoba to a wealthy family. He was born in 993. Those of us who are keeping track of that timeline in our head know that that's right before the Civil War, right? So literally as a young man where his entire life sort of lay before him in possibility, right? He saw Córdoba destroyed, right? What a way to come into your manhood. His family flees Córdoba and he eventually makes it to Granada, that southern type we just talked about, where he was a spice merchant, okay? Highly educated spice merchant, right? Because we're of his background in Córdoba, and his elegance in Arabic soon caught the eye of the administrators at the court of Granada, who brought him into that court, and eventually he rose up in power until he became a very, very close confidant of the leader of Granada, obviously the Muslim leader, the Muslim type of leader of Granada. How close, you may ask? Close enough that he became the commander of his army for 17 years. So for just a second, that means, as far as we know, that he is the only medieval Jew who commanded troops in Europe. He was the single most influential Jewish man in medieval Iberia, right? He literally wrote a poem, which was, to us, sounds like incredible bragging, but it's true, right? That he was the David of his age, right? His poems are beautiful. How did he work these poems? Okay. Remember, both Hebrew and Arabic are cousin languages, right? They are Semitic languages. In many ways, they share many roots, but Hebrew was no longer a spoken language. It was not a living language. It will not become a living language until the 19th century. Okay, it's a liturgical language. It's a language you hear at synagogue. It's a language you read and study. So much like we read ancient Greek or Latin now, it's not a language that we use to tell dirty jokes. Okay, but you know what? Poetry sort of turns on dirty jokes, right? So like, if you're going to have a living language, right, a language that can speak to secular concern like love and power, then you need a language that's alive in the street. So the magic here was that people like Samuel Hanagid and others in the Hebrew Golden Age, they took the rhythmic rules and accents of spoken Arabic, which again, they all commanded. This is the language they spoke, okay? They took those rules and they applied it to their written sacred language. That's how they made Hebrew a poetic language again. But it was more important also to now bring in Arabic themes of secular poetry. Things like wine parties, love, right? The gazelle becomes this, this beautiful object of desire and fascination. In Arabic love poetry, the gazelle is always the beloved, right? Usually a beautiful young woman, sometimes a beautiful young man. What they do in the Hebrew Golden Age is all of that too, but then they also start to use the gazelle to represent Israel and the soul, right? So they innovate, taking themes that are important in secular Arabic poetry, now in a language that they speak privately. Okay? We must imagine these rabbi courtiers. These are men of incredible talent, right? These are men who are literary geniuses, but they are also incredibly powerful politically. They are the leaders of their Jewish communities. They command troops, right? At the hands of their Muslim leaders. They lead two lives. They have a public life in Arabic, and they have a private life in Hebrew. And it's in that private life where they're writing these poems, but also sharing them among themselves, right? That we get the glory of the Hebrew golden. So that's one aspect of the flowers of Convivencia, right? It allows these Hebrew sages to use some of the examples of Arabic arts to recreate an art that is important to them, right? But there is another example that shows us that these arts were also shared among people of different confessional traditions. And those are called the ring songs. Okay. Imagine, if you will, that song, Bye Bye Miss American Pie. Everybody knows the song, right? Of course we do, right? All right. How many of you think that you could sing the entire song, including all the stuff that we skipped, before the refrain that is what's running through your brain right now? Yeah, I mean, you know it's there, right? You use it to, like, get snacks or whatever, but like it's not a fundamental part of our enjoyment of that song. The enjoyment of the song comes from that refrain that comes back again. All right, keep this in mind. What a ring song is, it's a combination of two different poetic art forms. There is a classical Arabic ode, okay? That's most of it. When we see it written down, that's what we think the song is. It is this classical Arabic ode. It's traditional, it's elegant, it's almost always in the voice of a man, right? It is usually a man who is rhapsodizing about his beloved. This is what Arabic poetry is, right? Okay. We know, however, that these ring songs were likely all performed to music, right? And it turns out that after this beautiful classical ode, there was always like one or two lines, what we would now call the refrain. But these were unusual. This was the innovation. Tacking on that refrain at the end of a classical Arabic ode, that was the innovation of the Andalusian ring song. And those refrains were in Romance, the language of the streets, the language that everybody shared. Those refrains came in the voice of a woman talking back to the classical Arabic voice. And usually she's giving him a little shade. Right? So in the classical ode, he'll talk about all of the ways that he knows how to romance her and all the ways it's going to work. And then in just two lines at the end, she'll tell him all the ways he got it wrong, right? So when we read them now, 1,000 years later, okay, they're still provocative, flirty, bawdy, right? Like you can see how this would have really worked, performed in public spaces, in a street, where there were men, where there were women, where there were people who understood the Arabic, but also people who understood that romance. For this to work as a popular art form, and we know that it was very, very popular, it tells us something about the world that it came from, right? It's a world where people were not just multilingual, they were multicultural. And they expected women to talk back, right, to this classical masculine voice. One of my favorite things about teaching the ring song is explaining to my students how we figured out what this was. Because for hundreds of years, all we had was the classical Arabic, right? That's the only stuff that was written down. And people saw stuff at the end, but because it was a transliteration of the Romance into Arabic, it read like gibberish, right? And so people were like, oh, the copyist must have been drunk. And so they just kept it off, right? They just didn't pay attention to it. They didn't think of it as a foundational part of the art form itself, okay? Until people were studying the Hebrew Golden Age, because the ring song also works if you use Hebrew as the classical poem, right? Not just Arabic. And then people realized, oh, wait, these little refrains, like they matter. And then we were able to sort of piece it all together and get a sense of the complexity of what life was like in Andalusia and its beauty. And that didn't happen until the 20th century, okay? It literally took 900 years for us to be able to fully understand the art that was unique to this place, that could only have arisen from these communities working together. Now you'll remember that I mentioned that the refrain was usually sung back by a woman, okay? There was a category of young woman called Piyan. They were usually enslaved, they were usually gorgeous, they were usually trained to be musicians, to be poets, to be dancers, right? They were entertainers. They were courtly entertainers. They were highly prized. These were specialists. These were entertainers and quite valuable. Okay. You'll remember that I said that there was competition, not just in the artistic sphere, but also in the field of battle, right, in military battles. And so one of the things that would happen is that these women would often be taken as war conquests during battles, right? They were booty. And scholars now believe that some of these Kian who were taken as war conquests from the fields of Al-Andalus and taken to what is now France, parts of southern France, became key in the creation of what we call the troubadour tradition, the beginning actually of Western song, right? So this is another way that we see the fruits of convivencia sort of slipping in ways that we don't expect, right? So it's actually not a facile comparison when we talk about American Pie, right? Ultimately, that comes from a tradition that began with the ring song, right? Even 1,000 years ago. But of course, the fact that I'm talking about battles suggests that there was military conflict, right? And if you will recall, I mentioned that this is not a world devoid of conflict. It's just not conflict that falls along the religious lines that we expect it to fall along, right? It's conflict that falls along the things that human beings have always fought about. You know, we fight about territory, we fight about money, right? We fight about power. And that's exactly what those typists are doing. What ends up happening is that as these typists are competing with each other, one of them, in a battle where he is trying to protect his borders from a neighboring taifa, calls for help. And who do you call for help? You call across the Mediterranean to North Africa to your Berber cousins, and you're, please come help me. And the Berbers come, because that's what they do. And they do help. And then they're like, oh, this is sort of like home, but lusher. It's a little easier. And wait. You say that you're Muslims, but you're sitting here on the banks of the Gulf Kabir singing about love and drinking wine. What's that all about, right? So what happens is that Orthodox amongst those Berbers, those North African populations, right, are disgusted at what they see as this decadent culture in Al-Andalus. And so they decide to stay and clean it up, okay? And so for 200 years, different groups of North African Berbers will take over what was once this world of the typhus. Okay? They'll fight against the northern parts of the peninsula, which are still under Christian control, right? And this is where we start to see what becomes really religious conflict at this point. But the key thing that I want us to remember is that it's not the original Muslim polities. You know, those typhus aren't the ones that are trying to create a holy war. It's the Berbers who are coming in and they're like, no, we're going to clean this up. And it actually gets a little bit more complicated because there are strangers coming in from the north too. So there are religious zealots coming in from the south, right? Islamic Berber people. But there are religious zealots coming in from the north, from Rome, right? The Pope decides to designate Spain an area of crusade. So essentially what he's doing is he's telling the people in the Iberian Peninsula, I do not want you to go to Jerusalem. You have another fight first. You have to clean your own backyard of the infidel, right? And it turns out that when the Romans come, the Roman Catholics, usually in the form of clerics, monastic houses, right? They come in and they find the Moserites, right? These are, again, the people who have maintained the religion of their fathers. They have been Christians for longer, actually, than many other parts of Europe, but they speak Arabic, right? Rome's not happy with them. And they want to force them to adopt the Roman rite. So we will all be Christian in a particular way. You have to use this liturgy that the Pope says is the one you have to use, right? In many ways, it's the same kind of religious disgust at Andalusian diversity. So you see it from the south, right? Where these Berber fundamentalists are like, you people are doing Islam wrong. You see it from the north, where the Romans come in and they say, you most Arabs are doing Christianity wrong, right? In each case, it's the others, right, who are coming in, who are not part of that indigenous tradition that has grown up over generations, where yes, we shared different languages, but that language, even though it wasn't always easy, gave us glories like the ring song. It's these others that come in and say that ring song, rubbish, doesn't matter. What matters is that we be Muslim the right way. What matters is that we be Christian the right way. And the way that you have been doing it here, sharing stuff, that's not the right way. War. This is a painting of a famous battle called Las Navas de Tolosa, in which the Christians finally break the back of the Almohad Berber fundamentalists. Right? This happens in the middle of the 1200s. After that, Christians will start taking over city after city after city. Right? Cordoba will fall during this time period. That glorious mosque, from that moment on, Mass will be celebrated in it every single day. And when you go to that building now, it is actually called Cathedral, the Cordoba Cathedral Ancient Mosque. Okay. It has been reconsecrated as a Christian space. They are incredibly proud that Mass has rung from bells there instead of the call to prayer now since the middle of the 1200s. You can't pray there as a Muslim. Okay. And in fact, it got to the point where a couple hundred years after the city fell, they built a cathedral in the very middle of that mosque. So when you go to visit that incredible building, you see this forest of arches, and then you walk into the middle, and there is a Gothic cathedral, literally right in the middle of the building. Conflict. Okay, so what happens during this moment of conflict? What often happens in moments of conflict, people flee, right? And so people fled, not just war, but intolerance, right? People fled the intolerance that these Berbers were creating, especially in the south, and they moved north, and a lot of them congregated in Toledo. Toledo, I try to remember to say. Before it was in Cleveland, it wasn't, and it looks like this. Right? Again, this is probably sort of filtered, but it's so gorgeous. I was like, I have to do it. Okay. So Toledo is an ancient city, right, just north of what is today Madrid. And all of these people from the south flee to Toledo. It is under Christian control at this moment, but there is more freedom there than in the southern heights. And so they come with their families, with their wealth, and more importantly for us, with their libraries. All of those libraries that they had been saving up and collecting, in some cases over generations, and they all congregate in Toledo, where suddenly there is a community that arises to read these books, to translate these books, to send this knowledge forward. And ultimately, if we're taking a look at this period, right, the Muslim Iberian period, what is most important to world history is what's happening in Toledo right now, okay? Because what's happening in Toledo at this moment will lead to the discovery, rediscovery, rebirth, if we want, right? A renaissance of knowledge that was once thought irreparably lost, knowledge that the West didn't even know existed, but that had been compiled, translated into Arabic, and now is finally available to be translated back into a language the West could read. Okay, so this is what would happen. You would have groups. This was always a group project. It was only possible not just because you had the books, but because you had the people who could speak these tongues. And so you would have groups where you would have somebody who spoke Arabic and who would translate a book from Arabic, usually into Romance, right? The language that they all shared. That Romance at this moment is early Castellano, right? The language that will become Spanish. They translate it into Castellano, and then somebody takes that and translates it into Latin. And now in Latin, it can go forth. It can go to Europe where people can read it. And suddenly, Aristotle is in the West again, right? But it's not just regular Aristotle. I don't know how many of you have had, Jennifer's not here, so I can make this joke. The pleasure of reading Aristotle in the original Greek, right? But this is hard stuff, right? This is not everyday stuff. This isn't like, I'm going to relax a little bit, Netflix and chill. Like, this is difficult stuff. right? And so the version of Aristotle that is being translated, okay, the way that it was written in Arabic, was one that had already been annotated, that had been commented upon by an Arabic scholar, right? So the version of Aristotle that the West is given, because it is a gift, isn't just the words of Aristotle, it is the words of Aristotle with the comment of Averroes. And that comment is like the world's greatest Cliff Notes, because it helps you understand the text in a new way. So it's like you're getting two texts, two geniuses, two incredible minds thinking about these questions that have bedeviled humanity, right? For the price of one. All in Latin and all shipped out, right? So that somebody like Aquinas gets it and he's like, oh, and he can read it, right? And they all understood that they were indebted not just to the ancient master, but to the person they called the commentator, right? The Arabic commentator who helped them understand it, who added stuff to it, right? And when you take a look at some of the great paintings of the Renaissance, where they like put all the great minds together, and you see like Plato talking to so-and-so, right? He's there. He's the dude with the turban, right? He's the commentator. So that is another one of the great gifts, right? Perhaps the most important gift for the Western intellectual tradition is that Toledo becomes a door through which this ancient knowledge, not just the classical knowledge of Greece, but also the classical knowledge of the Persian library, right? The classical knowledge of the Sanskrit library, everything that Arabs have been collecting for hundreds of years when they were that empire, when they were the new Rome, everything is now available for the West. And they gobble it up. So to the degree that we have a scientific revolution, a renaissance, an enlightenment with a capital E, right? There is a significant question if that would have been possible without this gift. And it is ultimately a gift of convivence. I get so excited when I talk about this. Oh, I forgot to show you my pretty slide for this. A beautiful Arabic book. Okay. As we talked about, all good things must come to an end. Right? So, after the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, there is one little outpost that survives, where an Islamic polity manages to keep control of a little tiny island in Granada, right? So those of you who go to Spain, this is where you go to see the Alhambra, right? It's beautiful, it's gorgeous. It hangs on for about 200 years after this period. But everybody knows that it's not an actual political threat. Like it's not going to be able to rise again. It just sort of sits there. It is literally the golden goose, right? Because it pays about a third of its revenues, and it's very wealthy because it monopolizes the silk trade. It pays about a third of its revenues to its neighboring Christian kingdoms as tribute. And again, who's going to kill the golden goose, right? But somebody does kill the golden goose in 1419. Okay. And that comes as a result of the marriage of Isabel of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, who we now know as the Catholic kings. They marry against the wishes of everybody in their world. It's like this secret marriage, but they do it because they want to join their thrones and they want to create essentially a quota for the Christian world, right? They want to unify political control in the peninsula, right? But now not under the word of Allah, but under the word of Christ, right? Isabel for this is known as La Católica, the Catholic, and is currently in the process of being canonized for it. So we talk about the Catholic kings, right? It makes it sound like this power pair, this power couple, right, of early modern kingship. Most scholars now recognize that all of the force and energy is coming from Isabel, right? That she was probably one of the best examples that we have of a Machiavellian prince, right? In terms of like seeing her world, thinking 5 steps ahead, right? Trying to do what she could to safeguard her kingdom. And she came to an, for her mind, inescapable conclusion. And that is the era where we could have many different faiths, right? Many different people. That era is coming to an end. It was, as far as we can tell,
not a joyous thing for her, right? For example, she used to refer to the Jewish communities in the Iberian Peninsula as her Jews. She thought of them as her community. It was her job to protect them. But she was afraid of the fact that, for example, the Ottoman power in the East kept growing and growing and growing, right? And that Mediterranean Ocean that had once been the ocean of the Romans, it's an Ottoman Sea, right? And they're taking over parts of what are today Italy, right? They're taking over parts of North Africa, right? And they seem to be coming closer and closer and closer. And she is terrified. She is terrified that if she doesn't bolster her flank, that the Ottomans will sweep in. This to us now sometimes sounds a little ridiculous, but after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, that same Ottoman Sultan, Mehmet the Conqueror, right, landed in Italy, okay? He came so close to taking Rome that they were packing up in Rome, okay? The only reason he didn't do it is because he died, likely poisoned by his son, because of course, dynastic reasons, right? The Ottomans almost took Vienna, right? Like we forget just what a threat, right? This growing Islamic power, this emerging Islamic power really felt like to these kingdoms in Europe who at that time felt really, really fragile. And so Isabel's answer to that was, we're going to be stronger, and we're going to be stronger because we will all be unified. We will all be essentially Spanish together, and to be Spanish means to be Catholic. So in that very key year, 1492, the first thing that happens in January is they conquer Granada. So this last little city that had a Muslim ruler gone, she now has political control of the entire Iberian Peninsula, okay? That back door to Ottoman power feels a little more secure. How can we tighten it? How can we tighten that bolt? And so she comes to the conclusion that she has to make sure that all of her Jewish subjects become Catholic. And that is really the best way to understand the order expelling the Jews from Spain, which creates the Sephardic diaspora. She made it so hard. She did not want them to leave. This was an incredibly vital and wealthy and important part of her community. She wanted them to convert. If you decided to leave, you couldn't take your money. In some cases, you couldn't take your children, okay? So she was making it as difficult as possible, forcing them to convert. And the very fact that so many of them decided, no, the religion of our fathers is more important, gives you a measure of that community, right? And so they left. Many of them went to Portugal, where they were foundational in helping the early age of exploration there. Many of them went to North Africa. Many of them went to Constantinople, where it turns out the Ottoman Empire welcomed in Christians and Jews, and in many ways recreated the glories of Convivencia, which is not the way we normally think of the Ottomans, because we think, you know, Armenia and all the terribleness of that second dying stage of the Ottoman Empire. But at the beginning, it was actually much more tolerant of religious diversity and racial diversity than anything coming out of Europe. And Isabel breathed easier. It was unfortunate. She lost her Jews. The country lost a lot of capital, a lot of intellectual capital. But now maybe we were more secure because we were all Catholic together. But were we really Catholic? Maybe when so-and-so didn't eat ham. Are we really Catholic? And so that's really the way to understand the Inquisition, right? The Inquisition comes up as an institution to try to ensure that there isn't any backsliding, that we are all really Catholic together, right? And eventually the Inquisition will be looking not just at conversos, right? Jewish communities that convert, but also Islamic communities that convert, because about 100 years after the order expelling the Jews, a similar order is given to the remaining Moriscos, right? The remaining Islamic members of Al-Andalus. At this point, we're all España, we're all Spain, right? We're all European, we're all modern. We have all entered into a new age That new age, of course, we all know is the age of the West. It's the age of colonialism. It's the age of the New World. And the New World is found not by Ottomans, but by Isabel, right? And it is found by Isabel when, again, in that key year, 1492, right? Now we're in August. It's been a rough year. Lots of stuff has happened. This Genoan comes up and says, ooh, I have heard, Your Majesty, your Catholic Majesty, that there is a king in China who's really, really curious about Christianity. In fact, he may even want to convert. And I think if we can make peace with him, maybe together we can join forces and we can then take Jerusalem, which, by the way, have you heard, the Ottomans have just taken. That's the kind of deal that Isabel is not going to turn her back on. She's Isabella la Católica. So she's like, yes, Christopher Columbus, you take your 3 boats, see what you find. Maybe we can find that Chinese king. Maybe we can capture Jerusalem for the greater glory of God. Don't forget, though, we might be able to do some trade too. So take all the good stuff, right? Take a translator in the lingua franca of the world. So it was an Arabic translator, right? And you head out, see if you can find China. And of course, he got lost. And that brings us to our next stage and the end of Convivencia. But again, what I hope that we get from our trip there in these last 2 classes is not just an understanding of this world that existed, which as an historian is very important to me, right? And it's often told that, history is told by the victors and like the only kinds of historical stories that matter are the ones that are productive. And historians will always tell you, no. We usually learn so much more from the dead ends of history, right? The people who had dreams that were never achieved, those who were vanquished, those who were human, right? And who had a different experience that is as valuable to us, in some cases more valuable, because it's a perspective we thought we had once lost. So I hope you got a sense of that, but also a sense of just how productive that world was for the world that we now live in. And maybe a world that we could live in again, because one of the reasons why this is so captivating to so many of us is this idea that convivencia is even possible, right? That we can imagine a world where the Abrahamic traditions can live together. And we know it won't be easy. Any of you who have brothers and sisters, I literally left my children squabbling over Minecraft. We all know it's not easy, right? But that doesn't mean it's not possible or that it's not worth it, right? To find some kind of love among these fraternal confessional traditions that bestride our world today.
Awesome.
We're trying to figure out what time it is.
It is 9:43.
9:43. I have 2 minutes for questions.